Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine Anaya, and welcome to the Women's Eye podcast. This is where you are going to meet fascinating women who are leaving their mark, making a difference, and changing lives. This episode is brought to you by Casco Financial Group in Phoenix, Arizona. Catherine Scrivano is the president of Casco Financial Group. She started her business to help people create the financial strength they need to achieve their dreams. And she believes you don't have to be wealthy to be wise. And it is always a pleasure to welcome Catherine as my guest today to talk about bad money habits like lending money to family and friends and saving too little. We'll talk about why these are poor habits to have and how we can go about breaking them. So Catherine, welcome to the Women's Eye podcast. Always a pleasure to see you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, thank you. I love this subject because I think all of us can relate to it at some time in our life, whether it be something major, something small. I think we've all kind of developed one of these habits, at least somewhere along the line. So let's talk about these bad money habits. And first of all, how do we go about developing them?
Well, a habit of any kind is something you do repeatedly. So I feel like when we talk about our good practices and our bad practices, today you and I can spend a few minutes about talking about bad money habits.
Yes, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about, habits. We've all made bad money mistakes, okay? They're mistakes. But then when do they go from mistakes to actual habits?
It's that old joke, doctor, it hurts when I do this. And the doctor says, stop doing it. This is kind of sometimes self-inflicted when we have these bad money habits and we repeat them over and over and don't learn the lesson and move on.
How long does it take to develop a habit?
I don't know. I know that I read once that it's 3 weeks or 21 days to develop a habit. I have a friend who was determined to break his habit of putting on his right shoe before his left and could never pull it off 21 days consecutively.
It takes effort.
I'm sure that that's a generalization. Those who are qualified would have a better answer than I, but I think for us, because if we don't make bad money decisions on a daily basis, we can high five ourselves. But we have to be vigilant and be prepared to avoid those things that do come up without our expectation.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and dive in and talk about some of the examples that you like people to understand and know about as far as bad money habits and how to break them, starting with lending money to family and friends. Ah, yes, I'm guilty of this. This is more than just a small loan though, right?
Oh, absolutely. I was with a friend recently, discovered I had forgotten my wallet, and she had to pay for wine and tip the valet. She knows I'm good for that. I'm talking about thinking seriously about making significant loans or co-signing if someone asks you to co-sign a loan for them. And with the economic instability that we've been going through COVID-19, I think more and more people are confronted with the ask from friends and family members to have loans to tide them over for this, that, or the other.
So what is the best way to approach this kind of transaction? So say, for example, you do end up loaning somebody money for a house or for a car, and maybe it's not a practice enough that you would call it a habit, but it's certainly something you should be mindful of, right?
Absolutely. Well, the first thing I would ask is that you insist on taking a little bit of time. So don't respond immediately. Tell them that you need to think about it. One of the things that I think you should think about is, why are they approaching you instead of a traditional financial institution? Because if the reason that they're coming to you is that they are not going to be approved at a traditional institution, recognize that that baggage is going to come along with them into this loan. So kind of thinking about that, thinking about costs and the consequences. We had a very sad case a number of years ago where a man drove his mom, who was our client, into the office. She was well into her 80s, and he had a brilliant plan to pay off all of his credit card debt as a loan from her. She would withdraw from her IRA. He wanted $80,000. Now,
Mm.
I was concerned about someone who gets into $80,000 worth of credit card debt, being able to pay back, being prudent about money. But also when we showed the cost in income taxes to her, they were both quite startled. They hadn't thought about that. And frankly, if he didn't pay her back, it was going to make a significant difference in her ability to maintain her lifestyle. It was just a bad idea on paper. It was a hard thing for a mother to turn down her son. That ended up becoming my role. But these are things that you really need to think about. There's going to be consequences if you decide to go ahead and make the loan, fully aware. Please put it in writing. This should be a business transaction. It's not only going to reduce the chance of you losing your money, but hopefully it's going to reduce the chance of misunderstandings and be able to preserve that relationship.
Mhm. Which is so, so very important,
And
especially when you are talking about money.
yeah, and I'd like to add the flip side. Another
Mhm.
bad habit is borrowing from friends and family.
Ah, yes,
try
good point.
try to get into the more traditional lending system if you're able. I realize some folks are unbanked, some folks are very challenged, but that easy call mom for money may come back to bite you. I personally, many years ago, borrowed money from a family member, and it was a source of contention for the rest of his life. He was
Mm.
never able to let me forget it. Believe me, I regretted it for the rest of our relationship. It just wasn't worth the convenience of saying, hey, could you loan me this money, rather than finding another way to get it.
Right. Something very important to keep in mind for preserving those relationships, as you
Yeah,
mentioned.
I
You
think that's
also
the most
touched,
important thing.
yes, you also touched on spending more money, like a credit card, or getting in debt that way. And so I wanted to ask you, that's one of the bad habits, the bad money habits that you say a lot of people develop, and that is spending more than you make. It's very
Mhm,
common, happens
mhm.
far too easily. Where do people go wrong here?
Well, I think that they are thinking short term, and believe me, I know the lure of impulse buying. But when we look big picture, we realize that if we're spending more than we make, it's not sustainable. Eventually, it's going to come back. And you can avoid that pain by not starting it, knowing
Mhm.
how it's going to end up. Again, doctor, it hurts when I do this. Stop doing it. You're not going to be able to make up the difference. Don't fool yourself into thinking that you can.
Is there a trick that you use, or a singular piece of advice that you give people to avoid falling into that trap? Some, questions they should be asking themselves?
You know what? I ask you to bring out your imaginary friend who says, this is what I'm doing, or this is what I'm thinking of doing. What advice would you give them? And you would give them great advice about waiting before making purchases, or having distractions, having alternative ways of satisfying whatever that is. You would encourage them to make a plan. You probably encourage them to work with a professional. Let that professional be the one to help them figure it out. Very often we can't see the forest for the trees. And this could be all that's going on here, is that you're not able to see the long-term effect of short-term decisions.
Here's another bad money habit that you talk about, something you call magical thinking. What exactly does that mean, and how does it happen?
I'm surprised how often we run into this. This is magical thinking is really just a solution that may or may not happen, but you incorporate it into your long-term planning. For instance, we've all met folks who say, when I win the lottery, and it's fun to fantasize, but please don't put that into your financial plan and make decisions today based on that windfall. Another more realistic one, though, that we see, especially for people who are planning retirement, is the expectation that they'll get a big inheritance and spending it. I'm putting that in quotes, but we're incorporating that into the plan before they ever receive it.
Hmm. Are there some strategies then to avoid that thinking, letting your mind go to that place?
If you anticipate an inheritance, if there is reason to believe that could be potentially true for you, there's no reason not to incorporate that into a what if scenario. So
Hmm.
what if we retire and at this point in our retirement, we inherit this amount of money? But I would also encourage everyone to do a what if scenario. We do it all of the time, the scorched earth scenario, where perhaps instead of inheriting money, you're actually helping family members financially and looking at what decisions you can make right now that might impact those scenarios without you having to give up your goals and your dreams.
Absolutely. You also point to saving too little or not at all, perhaps, as another bad financial habit. What is the thinking behind that kind of decision?
The thing that we hear most often is, I don't have enough to put away, so what's the point? They feel like if they can only save small amounts, that it's not going to really benefit them.
How do you get people to change that mindset? I know I've been in that place at some point in my life before I became
And we are,
financially educated.
yeah, yeah, and we all have, and probably will be again in some aspect. But training and experience and just maturity teach us that all of our habits are best developed slowly. uh, I'm not going to decide to run a marathon tomorrow. I'm not going to say, oh, you know what? I think I'll go hike the Grand Canyon this weekend. I'm going to prep for that kind of thing. I'm going to create the habits that are going to lead me to successfully run, hopefully finish the marathon, make it out of the Grand Canyon. You're just taking consistent steps to get in shape. And I think savings is a habit as well. So if you
Hmm.
start small, just developing the habit is more important than the actual dollar amount, because once you've got that habit, you're going to find it's really easy to maintain. And then you'll be able to do significant things with those savings.
Those are the positive habits we like talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, we know budgeting money is important, but some people, they develop the bad habit of impulsive buying. You pointed to that earlier because they don't live with a spending plan. So very
Mhm.
critical. Can you give me some examples in how to break that habit?
Have you ever gone grocery shopping when you were hungry?
Oh, yes.
They don't
I buy
make the
way too
carts
much.
big enough, do they? Or I recall a time when I bought 3 pairs of shoes. They were identical except for color, because my feet hurt when I went into the shoe store and these shoes were comfortable. And they were really expensive. This was just an impulse. But had I gone to the grocery store with a list or have a spending plan that includes clothing, I'm going to be more likely to be able to live within those. So you're going to be able to reduce impulse buys by having a plan. And on the other hand, focusing on all of the things, the experiences and opportunities you'll miss if you don't have one.
Mhm. There is an underlying theme here that I'm hearing, and that is to have a plan. So that kind of leads me to my last question, which is, having inadequate financial literacy is one of those habits that you say is a bad money habit. And I've been guilty of this, as I mentioned in the past. So explain why that's not good and how we can overcome that.
Well, I think the starting point is that people think it's too difficult to learn, that it's too complicated, and really it's not. There are resources for every level. I teach in high schools a lot. So I'm teaching 16-year-olds who have their first job and making their first money decisions. It's real basic, but they are so inquisitive. I absolutely, one of my favorite things to do. But the consequence of not learning is very likely relying on someone else to be financially responsible for you. You can lose some independence. One of our most popular workshops is called My Spouse Always Handled the Money. And the audience for those folks are people who, due to death or divorce or similar circumstances, are all of a sudden responsible for their financial lives. And you don't want to be learning this when you're stressed. So there really is no reason not to take on financial literacy, use the resources available, have confidence. And once again, maybe it's a time to talk to a professional and have them as a coach or walking side by side with you as you go on this journey.
Well, it certainly has helped me, that's for sure. So I can vouch for the fact that it works. Catherine, thank you so much. Always a pleasure talking with you and becoming more educated. And in this case, helping us understand the bad habits, the bad money habits, and how to avoid them. Very, very important. Thank you.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
By the way, you can learn more about Catherine Scrivano by going to our website, which is thewomenseye.com. I also want to let you know that The Women's Eye has a book. It's called 20 Women Change Makers. You can shop for it wherever you buy books and at changemakersbook.com. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Women's Eye podcast. I thank you so much for joining me. I'm Catherine Anaya. Until next time, it's the world as we see it.